Okay, so let's try to advance with this. I may not finish everything before 12, but I'll have at least a couple of videos up there. The Bauhaus. We were discussing how the Bauhaus had an approach to design that is functionalist, that intends to be clear, that has high contrast, that is in a way has precedence as a concept in the arts and crafts movement, but it is also far more simplified, right, as we see here. So the Weimar Bauhaus had to close and move to another city. What happened was that the Weimar Republic in Germany became conservative after they, a new board, elected board came to be voted on. And so they had to close, or rather they forced Gropius to close, or they he eventually did it voluntarily, but ultimately it would have happened sooner or later. So he made allegiances with industrialists in the city of Dessau. And so the Bauhaus, the entire school, moved to Dessau. And there they were given funding by these industrialists to create new buildings. And this is really the realization, you could say, of this idea of the total work of art, right? As you can see, this is just one of the buildings, and I'm going to show you different views where you can see more of them, but it's very, very functional, right? What we have here is, first of all, the typography is designed by Herbert Bayer, and it's called the universal typeface. Very important word for it, universal. And we'll discuss the characteristics of it later, but just that you see that that's what we see in there on the wall. One feature of this building is the curtain wall. The curtain wall is a glass wall where the wall or the structure of the building is communicated or is supported rather by steel frames, but the glass has no load-bearing function, right? So if you look around you, driving around in any city, and even in a small city like Dahlonega, you'll see buildings where this is the case. This is inherited again from the Bauhaus and from another artist called Le Corbusier, who conceptualized the idea of the curtain wall, right? So glass that allows natural light to come in. Natural light was, of course, something nice, but it's a fairly new feature in architecture because it is associated with health as well, right? The idea of well-lit rooms and buildings in general is connected with the idea of living a kind of healthier life. You don't have to be in the darkness. You don't have to have small windows around you. So the building is significant in its design for many reasons. But first, we want to contrast it to two other kinds of buildings. Look at on the top here. We have the University of the Arts, as it is called now. It used to be called the School of Fine Arts back then. This is the 1902 building, right? A photograph of it, and you can see that this is a traditional building, what we call a Beaux-Arts building or a fine arts building, which is very symmetrical, right? So there's one entrance there with a very marked by this roof, which is called the mansard roof, that calls attention to the center. It has two wings, very symmetrical, right? This other portion of it also has a pediment, which comes from Greek times, and two sides that are largely identical. So this was the type of building that you would encounter, very public, large statement building, right? That was created by governments in the late 19th century. Here we have, you might remember this, the Secession building from the Vienna Secession. And that this was a group of artists that realized that in Austria, admittedly, not in Germany, they didn't have a place to exhibit. So they purchased a building and they decorated it according to their own taste. The building is, because it was new, but nevertheless it uses again the symmetric configuration, but it has a number of things in there, like this ball made of leaves that are translucent, and this leaf motif, right? Nature motif, completely different from this approach, right? So this is ultimately an expressionist building. It's a building that is meant to uplift the spirit, and it is associated with the aesthetic movement and with expressionism in Austria. And for contrast, look at the Bauhaus building complex, right? It has no ornament. I mean, both of these buildings are very ornamented, architecturally so, but nevertheless very ornamented. The Bauhaus building is fully functional. The idea is that ornament is function, and function is ornament, rather, or form is ornament. So form follows function. The building does not have superfluous ornamentation. The structure of the buildings is the ornament itself. The materials themselves, with their functions, such as in the case of glass, transparency, they communicate meaning. They are the ornament in themselves, right? We also can see the asymmetrical configuration, completely different. As we will see, the door of the building is here on the side. It is small, right? It's a comparatively small door. So here, compare with the Beaux-Arts building, right? Entrance in the middle, very well marked, creating a category. And the same thing in here to some extent, right? With that large golden ball. So ultimately, what we are looking at is, today this building would look to us, if you drive around, like going to Atlanta, for example, you'll see many buildings like this, and you'll see, oh, it's the most common thing, and then you might even think it's ugly. But at this time, this was a revolutionary concept. And the idea, again, that you didn't need ornamentation that was added. You could have the most functional building for the purpose that it was intended, and that made it beautiful, okay? Okay, just again, kind of some characteristics: asymmetry, as we said before, interconnectedness of the buildings. They are not isolated, right? Large complexes, you could go from one end to the other. Then we have functionalism, again, the idea that function is form, function follows form, or rather, form follows function, I'm sorry. Form follows function and function is form. We have the majority of the buildings emphasize horizontality, right? And a little bit less the dormitories. These are the college dorms, right? And they have balconies, etc., very clean, very lit. Again, light being a very, very important aspect of this. The workshops were here. And I'm sorry, the workshops were here. 3 floors of workshops, right? On all kinds of things. Very much like our own department, as a matter of fact. I was thinking about that last night, except we don't have architecture. But the idea of, again, the workshops that were about traditional arts, but more importantly, about the functional arts, like graphic design, like design in general, product design, working with 3 dimensions all the time. So we have the student dormitories, as I said, the workshops. These are classrooms and some additional smaller workshops. And this is the administrative building. And this is essentially a corridor with meeting places, right? So everything is connected. It's a very, very modern concept. And glass, light, simplicity, horizontality, functionalism overall prevail. A closer view of the curtain wall and the door, as we see here, right? The crawl space or basement, however we call it, it still has pretty large windows, right? It's not quite as lit, but very, very large windows. And again, the door is very simple, okay? All right, so we now move on to typography. The Bauhaus produced several typefaces by different typographers, but the one that perhaps has come to be closely associated with the Bauhaus is the Bayer universal lettering, right, which we see here. It's very interesting. Now, Bayer, being German, German is a language where there are a lot more uppercase letters. Every noun is capitalized, right? So in English, we capitalize at the beginning of the sentence, we capitalize for proper nouns, we capitalize for names in certain occasions, but overall, there's not a whole lot of capitalization. On the other hand, in German, there's a lot more. But Bayer, in a very revolutionary way, he wasn't the first one either. He claimed that this was completely unnecessary, right? That capitalization was not needed because we don't pronounce the capitals, right? So if I say my name, when I write it, it's capitalized, but when I say it, it's not capitalized. So why should we have capitalization in the first place? So he designs this alphabet, which, as you can see, is very simple. It's organized around circles, right? It's geometric, right? But it is perhaps, it's also monospace, right? And monoline, because it is the same width, right? So we don't have changes in width. It is sans serif, needless to say. But at the same time, it has some issues with it, which are very interesting. So for example, the U, where is it? The U here and the N are the exact same symbol upside down, right? And that is somewhat strange, because again, typically we would assume that the U has to shrink itself a little bit, right? Not be quite as wide. The M, on the other hand, is the same width as the U, but then it also becomes, so it feels very narrow to us, right? The T is, again, just a fairly narrow letter, all things considered, and so it looks very narrow next to the U that seems very wide. In certain words, such as this one, blonde, it works really well, right? Because we have the repeated circular shape in here, and even a circle fits in the end. So it's very geometric, it flows, it seems, again, very continuous, almost like it has a cursive quality to it, because you don't stop, right? It's almost one motion and that's it. So it's very simplified. But it was used, it continues to be used. Eventually he refined it, he did develop an uppercase set as well. But this is the early one, like the most radical one of them all, right? Eventually, like if you go and to choose fonts, let's say in Microsoft Word or in PowerPoint, you will find the Bauhaus. But it's a more modern version. It's an updated one, because again, it needed to be updated because it was a little bit confusing, especially when it came again to some letters being the same, like that, reversed, or some of the letters being too wide or too narrow when we expected them to have a variable width, essentially. So nevertheless, it's a testament to the philosophy, right? It's a testament to the philosophy of the Bauhaus, because it really is all about simplicity. It's all about simplifying to its smallest terms, let's say, or its most functional terms, in the sense that we are not making changes and adaptations. It's universal. That's really the point here. Okay, now one other thing that the Bauhaus developed and was very interested in was photography. So photography obviously is a mechanical process that, to a large extent, even today, as I'm sure you know, has replaced drawing, right? So, in an academic tradition, artists began all their education through drawing, and they had to become absolute experts at drawing. Today, we still draw, right? But not nearly as much. And in part, that's because we have replaced drawing with photography, right? Even when making a drawing, we take a photograph and then sometimes draw from the photograph, which is something your professors don't like, and they are right. But nevertheless, photography still has a major role in art making and in painting. So the Bauhaus, because it was interested in the machine aesthetic and in modern design, they accepted photography readily, and they wanted to make a point about that, right? Now, they also were very interested in integrating typography and photography. So they decided that there was something called the typo photo, The typo photo is a creation, such as the one we see here, called Bauhaus with lowercase, as you can see, that that combines typography, right? That combines lettering with photography. And you might say, well, this is not a photograph, and it's a photograph that has been made to look to some extent a little bit like a drawing, right? But it began with a photograph. So we also have this emphasis on the transformation or connection between 2D and 3D, something that the Bauhaus also had as a general principle, and basic elemental forms. So this is a cone. No, it's not a cone. What is this? Is it a cone? Well, I don't remember. It looks like a Hershey to me. And we definitely have a ball there, right? A sphere and the cube, right? And it's casting a shadow, right? But you see, it has a shadow, so it is three-dimensional, but it's also casting a shadow that is flat. This one is casting a shadow that is flat. This kind of one is casting a shadow that is flat, right? So the cone and the triangle, the sphere and the circle, the square, I'm sorry, the cube and the square, form that is 3D and shape that is 2D, and they are connected with each other. They are not separated. We go from one to the other and back. To make art, we use tools that are like the square ruler here, right? The square ruler is an element that was key in Bauhaus design. They always used the ruler. And the idea was that, again, you were not allowing yourself, almost, you could say, to use a gestural line, right? The line needed to be always straight, always precise, made with a tool such as a pencil that would not have a width variation. Because, you know, when you draw with a brush, the way that you apply the brush, you know, you press or you lift, will leave varying widths and varying, the mark will be have a lot more variation, whereas with a pencil, it can be much more controlled. So the Bauhaus is focusing on that. So here we have a magazine that was printed with information about the Bauhaus, you know, architectural designs, etc., some text, but then it's folded, creating a sense of volume, and then it has juxtaposed to it the square ruler, the three geometric forms that are casting geometric shapes, right? So geometry is key in this design. And this is, as a matter of fact, a typo photo. So it involves photographs that are in a photomontage situation, but have now been cleared, right? If you remember the older photomontages, such as we saw here, for example, this is the Dada mess. The photomontage is convoluted, it is irrational, it comes from other things, and the type has been juxtaposed to it, right? So we do have precedents for the idea of the type of photo, but there are very, very different intentions. And then in this one from the Soviet Union, we have photographs of the two leaders, Lenin and Stalin, juxtaposed with text, but they are symbolic, right? They are symbolic of, obviously, political power, etc., etc. In the case of the Bauhaus, the meaning is there, and it is to indicate, as a matter of fact, the philosophy of the school, right? So we are now moving on to the new photography, and I have a few minutes, so I'll try to continue. We have two things to talk about: the new typography and the Ring Neue Werbegestaller, which means circle of new advertising designers. All right, these are two things that were not directly connected with the Bauhaus, or rather, they are directly connected with the Bauhaus, but they don't spring from the school. They were other people who took over this situation. So one of them is the invention of the typeface called Futura. You might have heard of Futura. It's very well known. It's still used today. It is actually really pretty. I like it. But it was not created at the Bauhaus. It was created by Paul Renner. But nevertheless, it became very popular, and it came to be closely associated with the spirit of functionalism of the Bauhaus. So this is why. It's because it's based on geometry, right? So it says here in this flyer that is contemporary, the anatomy of Futura, anatomy of Futura, right? The word is important, is founded on geometry. And so the word geometry has a circle, a rectangle, another circle, two intersecting triangles, another rectangle, and then two combined shapes and the square, right? So the idea is that Renner, did not just say, oh, I'm just going to design the typeface, thinking about, I don't know, thinking about making everything vertical or horizontal. I will use these basic geometric shapes as the basic form, which is why the A has a point. You know, sometimes in typography, the A will have a rectangle, but he adds the triangle, right? And that is something that is done in all three of the sites. Just here, this is, I typed this using Futura, and you can look at the M. The M is quite odd, right, for an M, but it's because it's intersecting triangles. The T does not have the little tail. It's very narrow. The J, again, looks like it's very nondescript, right? So it's a geometric typeface. It works well in context. In other words, when you look at the T, it looks strange. When you look at the word geometric, the context of the two letters that are flanking the T allows us to recognize the T very easily. So it still works, right? It is and it's very balanced. So it is monospaced. I'm sorry. Yes, it is monospaced, but it's and monoline as well, right? This is Futura Bold, which was also designed by Renner at the time, and then there have been variations ever since. I wanted to show you this because I found this interesting photograph here. He did obviously experiment, right? So these are earlier forms of Futura that were never actually released, but this is telling us how the typographer is playing with the letters, you could say, and making each of them, playing with the spacing, the kerning, right? And experimenting. So it is something that if you click on this link, there are more photographs of this phenomenon in there, which I found really interesting. So Futura became very well known. It was a lasting contribution, if not of the Bauhaus itself, of Renner was definitely connected with the spirit, you could say, of the Bauhaus. And again, of course, we see the connection here, right? That approach to geometry, that approach to integration of typography with other areas, such as geometry here. Now, one thing that is interesting is that this idea was not entirely new, right? I mean, we have seen it before, for example, in the dot. Now, the dot of the 18th century was, first of all, a serifed type, right? And it was not monoline, but nevertheless, the idea of using rulers and squares and compasses and, you know, all of these techniques and measuring and a grid is the idea of using geometry, right? So even though it has a completely different look and it has a completely different approach to design, the use of geometry was something that was inherited from the period of the Enlightenment, which is not surprising because the Enlightenment, in a way, was associated with science and with rationalism, which functionalism was also associated with. Then we have the new typography. So the new typography was a concept introduced by Jan Schichold, and Schichold created a concept called the new typography, but it's largely based off the Bauhaus ideas. The new typography was a catch-all term for all movements, new movements in typography. And it is part of the machine aesthetic, right? It's the idea of creating typography for, or typeface that would be clear, that has the function of legibility and readability. So he wasn't directly part of the Bauhaus, but he was a great admirer and friend of the faculty. And there are two texts that he released. One of them is called Elementary Typography, right? So Typography News, it's a journal. And then in here, this particular issue was called Elementary Typography. Now, think about this. When we say elementary something, when we say, standard, it is essentially a manual, right, for typography that is meant to be the rule. It's what you use to make good typography. So it almost tells you, we've exhausted, let's say, experimentation. We've tried everything, and now this is the ultimate typeface, or these sets of typefaces, or the general approach to typography is so developed that nothing new is needed. So this is very, very similar to the ideas of the Stil, to the ideas, right? To the ideas of the Stil, to the ideas of suprematism, the idea that we have reached the point that is the most advanced, and that there's not much else to say about this, right? This is universal, this is international. We do not need divisions between black letter and Roman, none of that. This is a standard set of typefaces that are going to be ideal to expressing all kinds of ideas in the modern world, essentially. So the cover itself is also very interesting because it has the constructivist principles of asymmetry, emphasizing, these lines become very important in Bauhaus, right? Creating this kind of visual support, you could even say, for the word, right? And it's not underlining, it's just adding a line that will add support. Vertical and horizontal text is another thing. White space is another thing that we have here. Connection, even though, again, this Typography News was not really a publication of the Bauhaus, it clearly recalls the same principles, right? Clarity at all costs, a sense of order, hierarchy, just absolute clarity. Okay, and then my favorite one is this one, a book he then released in 1928 called The New Typography. The New Typography was essentially a manual, right? And he told you what not to do. So this is one of the most famous pages of the book, where he is giving you an example of what not to do and then an example of what to do instead. So clearly we see that the image is, he does not like centering of the images, right? And here he tells you, put it on the left, put it on the left, put it on the left, put it on the right, but then, essentially asymmetry, where the text and the image, or whatever you place in there, will create an asymmetrical composition. And then there's this quote, which is just a summary of everything that I have told you. The essence of the new typography is clarity. This puts it into direct opposition to the old typography, whose aim was beauty and whose clarity did not attain the high level we require today. Okay, so that's what Chihold says. And essentially he's saying, all other typefaces of the past, by which we could say these ones, for example, were not clear enough. Right? So this integration between text and image that we see in Le Girard by Jules Cheret, or in the Glasgow Institute of Fine Arts, this is unclear, right? He's telling you this is too idiosyncratic. Look how the E extends, right? Like that. Look how the text here is integrated with the figure to the point of not really allowing us to read Girard clearly. So this is not clear. He says, I am an engineer, I am an artist as an engineer, and I work with functionality, with clarity in mind, right? It's not beauty, it's not interest, none of that. It is connecting that. So it's modernism that has become to some extent dogmatic. And of course, what he is reacting to when it comes to the images is the 19th century approach that we looked at quite early in the semester, right? We have the Siege of Troy, the John Sanger and Sons Royal Circus Company, and the Aquarium Chunk, and all of them have images in the middle. All of them have text all around and in various places. And then, of course, he would have been horrified, right? She-Hulk. So we can see, we can see how this connects with the Bauhaus, and then we can see what he's trying to avoid, right? This kind of approach in which the image appears essentially in the middle of the text, right? Okay, and to finish, one of the things that is happening, of course, is that you know, artists and typographers and graphic designers are beginning to take these rules and apply them to the commercial world. So we have the Circle of New Advertising Designers. The Circle of New Advertising Designers is a group founded by an artist called Kurt Schwitters, and their focus is indeed advertising, right? The great you know, destination, you could say, of graphic design is advertising at this point, and beyond too. And so the constructivist principles and the Bauhaus principles to some extent are being used here. It's almost like a typo photo, where we have type juxtaposed with photography, with a geometric form or shape rather in the background, right? And it's advertising scales, a company that sold scales for food, with the text. But interestingly enough, to me at least, this is not so clear, right? There's too much juxtaposition, you could say. It is a little bit confusing. It lacks that clarity, let's say, of the Bauhaus design that we saw before. But again, once this took a life of its own, different graphic designers could take it into different directions, and this is just an early example of that. It's an application of the Bauhaus principles and methods to advertising, but then the result is perhaps not quite as successful, I mean, in my opinion. Okay, well, that is the end of it. We have a lot of terms, but not as many as in other units. So I hope you have enjoyed this. I surely did. The Bauhaus is always fun to discuss. So I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.